Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Mark. I always love getting up to preach when people are awake. Some lively songs when we're singing together at the top of our lungs. It's different when you get up here to preach, especially when you're talking about a topic like worship. Once we've had the opportunity to worship, especially songs like that, when you understand the words that we're singing, when we sing The Great Redeemer, when you understand the words that we're singing, when we sing the song that we sang earlier, there is a habitation. There is a place for us built by the living God. When you understand those words, and maybe even more so than just understand them, but when you're processing what those words are meaning that you're singing, it just puts a smile on your face. I can't help but be thinking about the habitation that is built by the living God. I can't help but think about how I love the great Redeemer and not smile. It naturally comes from that. Now, tonight we're talking about worship. And that may seem on the surface as a very basic topic. That may seem to the majority of people here as an extremely simple topic. And so I want to take an extremely simple approach to that, to talk about worship tonight. Earlier this summer, we had the Titus campers here at our building here at Keller, which is 6th through 8th grade boys. They all come to our building, 6th through 8th grade boys from across the area, and learn how to develop a sermon. They learn how to prepare a lesson, and then at the end of the week, they actually get to present those lessons on Wednesday afternoon at the end of camp. A few weeks after we had Titus camp, I got to go with some of our high school boys to Louisville's preacher training camp, in which they do the exact same thing, except for the high school boys. They help the high schoolers prepare a lesson, learn how to develop a lesson, along with some extremely uplifting and spiritually strengthening classes that they get to sit through. They also develop lessons there, present those at the end of the week. My point in saying all this is that during Titus camp, we were teaching the boys about how many different styles of sermons that they could prepare and really leaving it up to them. You know, you can choose what style of lesson that you want to preach. And one of the styles, probably the most simplistic style that I want to go with tonight, because we're talking about such a simple topic, is just using the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so before we talk about who we worship, it's important to talk about what worship is. Because if we don't understand what worship is, then when we start talking about who we worship, we might cross some things up. So when we talk about what worship is, the Greek word that we see in the New Testament as far as worship goes is this one, and I say this every time I use a Greek word, but you're going to have to ask Corey later for the pronunciation if you want it, but I believe it's proskuneo. And it literally means to worship. To proskuneo is to worship. And what it really is to kiss the hand of in reverence to, as a token of reverence, to humble yourself, to bow yourself. And this word is used a lot in different cultures throughout the old world, throughout Israel, and then even further east towards Persia. But it's all along the same lines. To proskuneo, to worship is to fall on your face, to bow before, to show reverence. That's really honestly what we see in Scripture too. When we start to see how worship is defined, the reverence that is offered, I believe it's very clear in Luke chapter 18, when Jesus is telling the parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector. Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, if you want to follow along, but I'll just tell the story. Jesus is telling a parable about this Pharisee who's standing on the street corner saying, "Look at me. Look at how much money I give. Look at how good of a person I am." And he's lifting up his eyes to heaven. He's lifting up his hands and trying to show people how good of an individual he is based on the things that he's doing. Now, based on our definition of worship, does that seem like he knows what he's doing? I don't really think so. If he thinks he's worshiping, but he understands what it means in Greek to proskuneo, to worship, then he's definitely being a hypocrite here. But as Jesus continues on in this parable, he then tells about this tax collector. And this tax collector is just distraught at the things that he's done. He doesn't count himself worthy by any means to be talking to the creator of the universe. It says in verse 13 that he would not even lift his eyes up to heaven. Instead, he just beat his chest, saying, "Have mercy on me, a sinner." If you truly want to understand what reverence is, or what reverent fear is, that tax collector put it into action. To realize that he was in a lost state, to realize that he needed help, and to realize that there was nothing that he could do to bring glory upon himself. Unlike the seemingly uninformed, but most likely, more likely, the hypocritical Pharisee. That's what it looks like to worship, though. To truly worship when we gather together, of course, a smile, of course, joy is produced when we're singing about the great Redeemer, but it's from a starting point that says, I am unworthy. Now, let's talk about who we worship, because this is really important, because throughout history, there have been all kinds of people, places, things that have been worshiped, right? That's what we just call idolatry. Anything except for God, if it's being worshiped, that's all idolatry, whether it's a place or a thing. If it's not God, it's an idol. And so when you ask, what am I supposed to worship, it comes down to who's worthy. Who is worthy of our worship? Who made you? Who blesses you? Who is holy? Right before I come up here, as I'm singing the Great Redeemer and thinking about Christ and how holy he is, I have a couple of verses that I want to share with y'all, but I had one more that came to mind. And it's actually Luke chapter 19, just one page over from where Jesus tells a parable about the Pharisee and the tax collector. But it's during the triumphal entry, Luke 19, 28 through 40. Jesus is coming into Jerusalem. It's what is called the triumphal entry in those little headings in Scripture. And as Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, all of his disciples, all of these people are praising him. They're laying their cloaks on the path before him. They're laying palm branches on the path before him. And they're saying in verse 38, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." They understand that he's worthy, that he's holy. In verse 39, though, and some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." These Pharisees don't think that Jesus is holy. They don't think that he is worthy of this worship that is being offered to him by his disciples. And Jesus' response shows that he is worthy and that he is holy. He answered in verse 40, "I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. If these people don't sing my praises, the rocks are going to sing my praises." Because Jesus is worthy of praise. If there's anything else that is even attempted to be worshiped, then we're already missing the mark. Because there is nothing else, nobody else, and no other place on this earth that the rocks are going to sing the praises of. These other verses, I think, are fantastic to show us that Jesus is holy, that Jesus is worthy of our praise. In Mark chapter 1, I've shared it with y'all before, Mark creates a little chiasm there at the beginning of his book where I won't explain what a chiasm is again. I did that a few months ago. But if you have a question about what that is, you can talk to me afterwards. But what it does is it creates this these tiers in the topics that he's going through, reaches a center point, and then it mirrors those same tiers with the topics that he's talked about in that paragraph going back out. And right in the middle, Mark adds this phrase that is actually spoken by the unclean spirit that Jesus is casting out in Mark chapter 1. But it says, I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Mark makes a point at the beginning of his book to emphasize, before he tells the rest of Jesus' ministry and the rest of Jesus' life, he is the Holy One of God. Of course, Matthew 16:16, which is Peter's confession, the same confession that we make today when we commit our lives to Christ, when Peter said, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You are the one, the Holy One. And then in John 6, we just studied this past Wednesday night in the adult class. Jesus feeds 5,000 people. They come to him again the next day, looking to have their bellies filled again because they realized, hey, he can provide food for us. Jesus tells them, it's not about this physical bread that I came. I didn't come here just to do these miracles, just to feed you. I came here to tell you about the bread that if you eat the living bread, you'll live forever, the bread of life. And Jesus says, I am the bread of life. You have to eat my body, drink my blood. People left him because that's insane. Why would you teach that? And Jesus turned to his disciples and said, are you going to leave as well? Jesus turned to the 12 and said, are you going to leave me also? And Peter's response, to whom shall we go? We have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. It doesn't take long flipping through this scripture to realize that Jesus is the one, he's the only one that we worship. But it's not just a matter of what is worship, who we worship. Just as Jerry read for us in John chapter 4, it's when and where. John chapter 4, I want to look at this a little bit closer. Jerry gave us a little bit of the context before he read the passage for us. But go ahead and flip over to John chapter 4. Jesus, along with his disciples, are coming through Samaria, and he sends his disciples on into town to go get some food for them. And in verse 7, a woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, give me a drink. Now, what's interesting about this is Jesus is a Jewish man, and he's beginning a conversation with a Samaritan woman. Two people who in this culture just don't cross. Not only is a man and a woman speaking in public not socially acceptable, not socially something that's done, but even more so than that, it's a Samaritan and a Jew. People that don't see eye to eye on nearly anything. But Jesus speaks to her and says, give me a drink. And she questions, why are you talking to me? Jesus begins this short conversation to then tell her about living water. He talks in 2 chapters later, in chapter 6, about this living bread or bread of life. But here he's telling her about living water. He's using these examples about things that we take in every single day in order to honestly continue on living. If you don't drink water and if you don't eat food, then those are really the things that you need to live. Jesus is using these things that we need to live to teach people about him, that we need him in order to live. And he tells her, go get your husband, because this message is for more than just her. And she says, I don't have a husband. Jesus says, I know, you've had 5, and the man that you're living with now, you're not even married to. And you can almost see her sheepishly like, oh, he knows all about me. But then she responds, I can tell that you're a prophet. Or in other words, I can tell that you're a man of God. And so she has a question for him, a spiritual question. If she can tell that he is a man of God, if she can tell that he is, quote unquote, a prophet or so, she says, I've got a spiritual question for you. And it's actually kind of interesting because I've experienced this a time or two myself. Not being a prophet or anything like that. But when people find out that I'm a minister, I will introduce myself. I'm Dylan Bruce. I'm the youth minister over at Keller Church of Christ. And when people find out, oh, you're a minister, you work in the church, I've got a Bible question for you. It seems like this lady is along the same lines of thinking. She says, oh, you're a man of God? I've got a spiritual question for you. Maybe you can help me answer this because nobody else seems to be able to know the answer. And she asks the question of where are we supposed to worship? Right, I tell this whole story about the living bread, the living water, Jesus' conversation with this woman, all to come down to this one question: where do we worship? She says, my ancestors, my fathers, they say on this mountain here in Samaria is where we're supposed to worship. But you, as in you people, as in the Jewish people, say that we're supposed to worship over in Jerusalem. So what is it? And Jesus' response still rings true for us today. Jesus' response to this woman, and if you've read it before, you know it. If you listened to Jerry before, you know it, is still true for us today. And yet I'm afraid we don't put it into practice as often as we should. It's not about the time or the place that we worship. It's not a matter of the walls of this auditorium. I would say 4 walls, but the shape of this auditorium has way more than 4 walls. It's not about this room. It's not about this building. And it's not about the exact time that we worship. It's about our heart. And if we let other distractions or other concerns slip in to when we come and choose to worship the creator of the universe, then our heart is not in it. If we're sitting here thinking, man, we started a minute late, what are we doing here? Or if we're sitting here and thinking, you know, Dylan's still preaching and it's 5:50, is he going to wrap up soon? Our heart's not in the right place. Or if we're sitting here thinking, oh man, how many songs are we going to have left? Or how long is this prayer going to go? I've got to be honest with y'all. When I was a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. That's a joke, but it's true. When I was a child, I thought in the way of a child, and I would often time how long a prayer was, especially if a certain individual that I know prayed for a very long time was walking up to pray. I would get my watch out that I got for my birthday, hit start when he started praying, and hit stop when he stopped praying, just to see, wow, did he set a new record? Obviously, as a child, I'm not understanding what we're coming here for, but I'm afraid that we subconsciously do that as adults too. We may not physically pull out our stopwatch and time. How long is Corey going to preach this morning? We may not physically pull out our stopwatches. We may not physically, and in the act of questioning how long are we going to be here, we may not let that quite literally become a distraction in our actions, but it's a distraction in our mind. But if we're going to worship in the way that Jesus commanded all the way back in John chapter 4, in spirit and in truth, those should be the farthest things from our minds. So the question is, how should we worship? What does it mean to worship in spirit and in truth? We know that's about the heart, but what is that really? Jesus says to worship in spirit and in truth. I want you to look first at 1 Corinthians, chapter 14, verse 15. Paul, as he's instructing the church in Corinth, says that I will pray with my mind as well. I will pray with the Spirit and I will pray with my mind also. Or I will sing with the Spirit and I will sing with my mind also. I believe it's the New American Standard Version that actually translates that to I will sing with understanding. I will pray with understanding. He says in verse 15, I'll just go ahead and read it for y'all. What am I to do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will pray with my mind also. I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also. Or I will sing with understanding. I will pray with understanding. I will be fully focused. I'm here. I'm ready to be locked in to what we're doing. That's something that is ingrained throughout different professions and throughout different sports that kids have, or whether it's any sort of extracurricular activity that our kids do in school. That's something that's ingrained into us, is you have to be focused. You have to be 100% ready for anything that may happen. For band kids, let's say one of the other people in your instrument class, whatever that's called, misses a note. Are you prepared, and do you know how to respond from that? For anybody that plays in sports, if the ball is hit to you, what play are you going to make? You have to be 100% focused. Our worship is the same way. Are we, for lack of a better phrase, locked in? That's what Paul is saying when he says, I'm going to sing with the Spirit, but I'm going to sing with my mind also. I'm going to understand what I'm doing. So, in the Spirit, it's a matter of pouring out our hearts. That definition we looked at the very beginning, proskuneo, to worship, to show reverence, to humble yourself. But it's possible to be here physically, sitting with our brothers and sisters, but be absent in spirit. You can be sitting in what we call worship, even on the cards that we hand out to people in the community to encourage them to come. We call these worship times. On the bulletin, what are our times of worship? It's possible to be sitting in worship, but not be worshiping. It's possible to be present physically, but be very absent in the Spirit. Whenever I talk about worship, though, I always want to include this little sub-point about emotion. What place does emotion have in our worship? The reason I bring that up is because of so many other churches within Christendom who feel the need to force-feed emotion into worship. They feel the need almost to entertain, so that people can feel this pull, can feel a tug on their heartstrings. And I've got to say, emotion is not bad. Emotion is not inherently bad. You can look in Psalms 122, Psalms 19. I won't have everybody flip over there for one verse, but David showed emotion when he entered the house of the Lord. He rejoiced. He was glad. In Acts 22, when the church was just beginning after Peter's sermon on Pentecost, and all of the Christians were devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and preaching and to the breaking bread and the prayer, that's worship. It says that awe came upon everyone. This word that we have for awe kind of morphs depending on how you use it, especially if we refer to awe as in awesome God. That can be a full feeling of wow, this is incredible. But it's also used in the sense of reverence, in the sense of reverent fear, this awe that came upon every soul in Acts chapter 2 is a sense of reverent fear that came upon every soul. The point that I'm trying to get from this is that emotion is not bad if it comes from a place of understanding. Emotion is not bad if it comes from a place of worshiping in truth, worshiping in the Spirit. We're going to be filled with joy when we sing the Great Redeemer. We're going to be filled with awe when we sing and understand the Creator of the universe. When we understand that we get to glorify and sing praises to the Almighty, joy and gladness and awe will naturally come from that. But what do you do with it? this emotion that naturally comes during our worship, what do you do with that? Do you use it to draw attention to yourself? Or do you use it to direct the attention back to God? That's all a matter of how you worship and where your heart is. This last thing that I want to show y'all is speaking of worshiping in truth. In Ephesians 5:19, Paul, writing to the church in Ephesus, says to not be filled with wine. Don't get your fill. Don't get that full emotion feeling from wine. That's debauchery. But instead, be filled with the Spirit by singing. And we're instructed to sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So to worship in truth means that we're to use our voices. What else? I think it's pretty clear when we look in Leviticus about how we are to worship that we don't get the liberty to add things to how we worship. God has instructed us to worship in spirit and in truth from the mouths of Christ, and through the inspired Apostle Paul to sing. Anything else we add to that will be just like Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus chapter 10. The sons of Aaron, who's the brother of Moses, so you got to know that these men are highly looked up to in the nation of Israel, took it upon themselves to change the way that they sacrifice or worship God. They decided the fire that God had instructed them to create for their sacrifices was not to their liking. So they created a different kind of fire. Don't know exactly what that means, but they created a different kind of fire, and the Lord used that fire to consume them because it was not the instruction that He gave them. So when we talk about how we worship, it must be in spirit and it must be in truth. You know, we offer an invitation every single time we have a sermon. I want to emphasize, though, that invitation is always open. You don't have to wait for a preacher to stand up here, or a youth minister, for that matter, to stand up here and proclaim God's word in order to ask for prayers from your brothers and sisters. You don't have to wait for a sermon and then an invitation in order to put on Christ in baptism. But tonight, if that is your need, or whatever else your need may be, the invitation is open, and we encourage you to come as we stand and sing.